What impressions has this series left you with regarding the concept of, clean coal or clean energy?
It's difficult to make an argument that coal can be clean in the way that most people use that phrase. That being said, it's also really important to recognize that coal is absolutely necessary to America right now. We are the Saudi Arabia of coal. And it's great to be able to switch on the lights and have a BlackBerry and basically use electricity without having to think too hard about the cost. That's entirely because of coal. And if we stopped using coal tomorrow, the nation would suffer dramatically. Now that being said, there's other forms of energy. There's natural gas, solar, etc. But one of the things, and there's ways to use coal that are cleaner. For instance, there's the new coal plants that are being built are called supercritical coal plants. They give off much less carbon dioxide emissions. But one of the interesting things about the debate going on right now, particularly in Washington, D.C., around cleaner energy, is that typically when something emits less carbon, it uses much, much more water. So a great example is the supercritical coal plants. They give off much less carbon dioxide. They use 90% more water than the average coal plant. Or natural gas is another great example. Natural gas is essentially the cleanest form of electricity production. But the way to remove natural gas right now is this thing called hydraulic fracturing or fracking, where they go in and they shoot a whole bunch of chemicals and water into the ground to break up the shale that contains the natural gas. And there's a lot of evidence that doing this is disastrous for nearby aquifers and drinking water sources. People say now that their wells and their drinking water has been completely destroyed by the fracking process. So we're kind of facing this big question where, as a nation, particularly under President Obama's plan, we've decided that we want to emit less carbon. But the cost of that might be more water pollution.
Until your series, I just never thought about that.
I mean, one of the ways to think about, to sort of frame this question is, over the last 30 years, American industry and industry worldwide has gotten very good at using two of the cheapest resources. The first of that was carbon. Agriculture, for instance, uses fertilizer, which is essentially carbon. We do all of our electricity production through carbon. We have this huge system of cars and roads that essentially are dependent upon carbon in the form of oil and gasoline. And corporations have gotten very, very good at optimizing carbon because it's cheap compared to other things. The other thing that's been very, very cheap historically has been water. As a nation, we have decided we're not really going to charge people market rates for water because we never want to be in a position where a poor person says, I can't afford to get a glass of water. But as a result, companies have become very, very good at using huge amounts of water because it's so cheap. Agriculture is another great example. I mean, basically, we grow a lot of crops through subsidized water. Coal-fired power plants are always situated typically next to rivers, because they have to take in so much water to cool down the facility constantly. And as a country, under President Obama's energy plan, we've decided to try and break the dependence on carbon. But the other free resource is going to take up some of the slack, and that's been water.
So, do you think that we as a nation should be considering charging the corporate use of really, really large amounts of water, charging them for that water, but not charging citizens for drinking water?
A number of advocates I talk to, environmentalists, say absolutely. But they actually take it a step further, because when you think about it, it's pretty difficult to come up with a system where we can rationally charge some people for water, but not others. But when I do talk to people about this, what they say is, the number one thing we need to do is that we need to let the market assign a value to water, and then we need to charge that price. But the inevitable consequence of that is that some people who we wish had water cheaply won't be able to get it as easily. And we need it to figure out how comfortable we are with that.
What about my tap water? I mean, how do how do I know if I'm drinking chemicals from the scrubbing process from coal-powered energy plants, or if I'm drinking weed killer? How can I find that out?
It's really hard, and that's the key issue. And we're actually going to do one more story later this year that looks explicitly at that. So we have a law called the Safe Drinking Water Act. And what the Safe Drinking Water Act says is it says that the water that we deliver to Terry Gross's home and anyone else's home has to meet a certain threshold of cleanliness. And if there is bad stuff in there, I have to tell you what's in there so that you can make an informed decision and decide not to drink it if you don't want to. Much like the Clean Water Act has essentially kind of fallen apart in the last decade or so, the Safe Drinking Water Act, in many ways, has also stopped working in two ways. The first of which is there's just a whole bunch of new chemicals that the Safe Drinking Water Act doesn't address at all. So there's literally thousands and thousands of chemicals that are invented every year. And there's a huge backlog of tens of thousands of chemicals that the EPA has never analyzed. So they can't say this should or shouldn't be in your drinking water supply. But the second way that the Safe Drinking Water Act has fallen apart is that many water systems, including, I know because we've looked at it, your water system, violate the Safe Drinking Water Act regularly. There's too much arsenic in the water. There's too much of these other contaminants and pollutants that are regulated. And the water system doesn't clean them out before delivering the water to you. And moreover, when they do warn you that there's bad stuff in the water, they do so in this way that it's just almost too easy for you to ignore. I'm sure when you get your water bill, you'll see some fine print that says, we violated the Safe Drinking Water Act this way and to this measure. But it's totally incomprehensible. It's for the average American, you can't figure out whether that's something you should be worried about or not worried about. And as a result, people basically don't have the information they need to make informed choices. And so one of the things that advocates tell me is that a huge change that should occur is that the EPA should just do a much better job, and water systems should do a much better job of just informing people, giving them the facts so that they can say, look, this month I'm going to use bottled water instead of tap water.